They drove in silence through the winding forest road, the canopy above casting long shadows as the sun dipped lower and lower. The family had left behind the familiar sounds of the town miles ago, and now only the crunch of gravel under their tires filled the air. Emily, Sophie, Jack, and little Lucy pressed their faces to the windows, eyes wide with wonder and maybe a hint of something else. The trees loomed taller here, dark and endless, stretching up to meet the pale evening sky. Finally, they rounded a curve, and there it was. The cabin. It looked almost as if it had grown from the earth itself, a dark wooden structure with ivy creeping up one side and moss softening the stones on the path. The windows glinted dully, catching the last rays of sunlight in an oddly cold way, and just behind it lay the lake, still as glass, a mirror in which the sky seemed to sink forever. "Well, here it is," Dad said, trying for enthusiasm, though his voice sounded strangely hollow in the thick, wooded silence. They piled out of the car, stretching stiff limbs and breathing in the forest air, tinged with the faint, musty smell of wet wood and something faintly metallic, something they couldn't quite place. "Who did you say left you this place?" Mum asked, scanning the surrounding woods with a look that was somewhere between awe and wariness. "An uncle, distant uncle," Dad replied, his brow furrowing. "I barely knew him. He lived alone for years, kept to himself. I think he just wanted someone to take care of the place." Lucy tugged at his sleeve. "Can I go to the lake? Please, Daddy." "Not alone," Mum interjected quickly. "It's a big lake, and we don't know how deep it is." They all walked down to the water's edge together, the dirt path crunching beneath their feet. The lake was vast and strangely perfect, like a sheet of black glass stretching far into the trees, reflecting the darkening sky. Not a ripple disturbed the surface, and it seemed almost unnatural in its stillness. Sophie shivered a little as a cool breeze drifted off the water, rustling through the leaves. There was something about the silence here that felt too quiet. "Why is it so dark?" Emily whispered, as if the lake itself might hear her. "It's deep," Dad replied, though there was something in his voice, a hint of uncertainty, of something he didn't quite remember. "I think it's a special lake. Lots of minerals in the water, maybe." But Jack wasn't listening. He was staring hard at the lake, feeling a strange pull, as if something beneath the water's surface was calling to him. He blinked, shaking his head, feeling silly. But as they turned to go back to the cabin, he glanced over his shoulder one last time. For a moment, he thought he saw something. A shadow moving just beneath the surface, gliding along the dark water like a hand reaching out. But when he blinked again, it was gone, and the lake was still once more. As the family unpacked and settled into the cabin, night fell quickly, as if the forest itself were swallowing up the light. Inside, the cabin felt old, like the wood and the walls had secrets pressed deep into their grain. The furniture was heavy, the kind that creaks and groans when you sit, and dust hung thickly in the air, catching the dim glow from the lamps they'd brought with them. Lucy was the first to notice something odd. "Where's my doll?" she asked, her little face creasing in confusion. She had been holding it in the car, clutching it to her chest, but now it was gone. The family spent nearly an hour searching, turning over blankets and looking under beds. They even went back out to the car and checked every corner. But the doll was nowhere to be found. Lucy's eyes filled with tears, and her lip quivered as she whispered, "I know I had it. I know I did." Mom hugged her close, brushing her hair back. "We'll find it in the morning." Sometimes things just hide. But Lucy shook her head, looking back toward the lake through the darkened window, as if some quiet voice had told her the doll wasn't just lost. It was taken. They settled into bed, the cabin creaking around them as if adjusting to its new inhabitants. Jack lay awake, staring at the ceiling, listening to the deep, unnatural silence. Then he heard it, soft, almost too faint to notice. A whisper low and murmuring, drifting up from outside. It wasn't the wind, he was certain of that. It was voices, whispering from the lake. He sat up, straining to hear, trying to make out words, but it was just on the edge of his hearing, like a chant, repeating over and over. He crept to the window, his heart pounding. The lake lay there, dark and endless, stretching out into the black forest beyond. Nothing moved, but the whispering grew louder, wending through the trees and slipping into his mind like smoke. He squinted, peering at the shore, and for a moment, he thought he saw a figure standing there. It was small, and he couldn't make out any features, but it looked wrong. Twisted somehow, like it was bending under the weight of something unseen. "Jack." The whisper called his name, drifting up from the lake like a hand reaching into his chest. He froze, his mouth dry, heart hammering as he realized the voice was coming not from the shore, but from the water itself. He stumbled back, blinking hard, and when he looked again, the figure was gone, leaving only the still, black lake reflecting the night sky. The voice stopped, leaving a hollow silence that pressed against his ears, a silence so deep he felt as if he were sinking, drowning in the quiet. As he lay back down, trying to convince himself it was just his imagination, he heard it one last time, faint and breathy. "Jack, come closer." Morning came slowly, with the sky clouded over and the cabin bathed in a dim, gray light. The family awoke to an unsettling quiet, as though the world around them was holding its breath. Breakfast was subdued. Lucy picked at her cereal, eyes red-rimmed from the tears she'd shed over her missing doll. Jack was silent, his mind still haunted by the voices he'd heard from the lake, voices he was almost certain had whispered his name. "Did anyone else hear anything last night?" Jack asked quietly, glancing around the table. Mom and Dad exchanged a quick look. "Like what, Jack?" Dad asked, forcing a light-hearted tone, though there was a tightness around his eyes. Jack hesitated, his gaze fixed on the window, where he could just make out the dark line of the lake through the trees. "Nothing," he mumbled, not wanting to say it out loud. "Probably just a dream." But it didn't feel like a dream. Not even a little. They decided to explore the cabin that morning, hoping to uncover some history about the place. Dad had mentioned that his uncle had lived there alone for years, but he hadn't said much about the man himself. Only that he was a bit of a recluse, someone who kept to himself. The cabin, Dad explained, had been in their family for generations, but no one had lived in it for years, not since his uncle had passed under mysterious circumstances, as Dad put it. "Do you think he died here?" Emily asked, her voice barely above a whisper. "Oh, I'm sure it was just old age," Dad replied a bit too quickly. He shot a nervous glance at Mom, who frowned but said nothing. They wandered through the small rooms, poking around the dark corners and old furniture. In the farthest corner of the living room, they found a dusty shelf lined with peculiar trinkets, rusted fishing lures, strange carved stones, a handful of old photographs in worn, cracked frames. The photos were yellowed with age, the faces faded and hard to make out, but Jack felt a chill as he stared at them. Something about the people in those pictures. There was a look in their eyes, a glint of something off, like they were watching him from somewhere far away. He pulled one of the photos closer, wiping away the dust to reveal a figure standing by the lake, his face turned slightly, as if avoiding the camera. The man's shadow stretched out beside him, long and twisted in a way that seemed almost inhuman. Jack blinked, feeling his skin crawl, and carefully put the photo back. Lucy was the first to notice that something else had gone missing. Her shoes, bright red with a little yellow star on the side, were gone from the pile they'd left by the door. "Maybe you left them in the car," Mom suggested, though Lucy shook her head adamantly. "No, I left them right here, right by the door." It seemed trivial, pair of shoes, but when they searched the entire cabin and found nothing, a quiet unease settled over them. They looked everywhere, under beds, in closets, even outside on the front porch, but the shoes were gone, as if they'd simply vanished. "That's strange," Mom murmured, biting her lip. "First your doll, and now?" Lucy stared at the empty space where her shoes should have been, her small fists clenched. "It's not fair. Something's taking my stuff." The rest of the day passed in a strange haze, the family trying to shake off the feeling that things were slowly slipping out of their control. But as evening fell and the light faded, the sense of unease only deepened. Sophie was next to notice something odd, a strange feeling in her room, a coldness that seemed to seep from the walls themselves. She pulled her blanket tight around her shoulders, staring at the darkened corners, feeling as if something was lurking just out of sight. The cabin was silent as they settled in for the night, the air thick and heavy. Shadows seemed to stretch farther than they should, bending and twisting in the dim lamplight. Every creak, every whisper of wind against the walls sounded like footsteps, like voices trying to break through. Around midnight, Jack heard it again, the soft, insistent whisper calling his name. This time it wasn't just one voice. It was a chorus, low and hollow, coming from the direction of the lake. He lay frozen in bed, straining to make out the words, but they slipped through his mind like water, just out of reach. "Jack, come to us." Unable to resist, he slid out of bed and crept to the window, heart hammering in his chest. He peered out into the night, And there, by the water's edge, he saw them, shadows, wind up along the shore, unmoving, staring straight at him. He squinted, trying to make out their faces, but they were shrouded in darkness, their forms barely distinguishable from the night itself. One of them lifted a hand, beckoning. Jack gasped, stumbling back from the window, his heart pounding so loud he thought it might wake the others. He pressed his back against the wall, breathing heavily, his mind reeling. Had he really seen them? Or was it just his imagination playing tricks on him? He forced himself to look again, creeping back to the window. But when he peered out this time, the shore was empty. The lake as still and silent as ever. The next morning, he tried to tell the others, his voice trembling as he described the shadows by the lake, but they only looked at him with concern, brushing it off as a bad dream. "You've been reading too many ghost stories, Jack," Mom said, ruffling his hair. But there was a tightness in her voice, a forced smile that didn't quite reach her eyes. And then, one by one, more things started to disappear. Emily's necklace, an old silver locket she wore every day, was the next to vanish, and this time she was certain it hadn't been misplaced. She'd left it on the nightstand, right beside her bed, but when she woke up it was gone. And then it was Sophie's turn. Her scarf, a gift from her grandmother, disappeared from where she draped it over the chair. Each missing item left a hole, a strange emptiness that couldn't be explained. By the end of the third day, the family could no longer ignore the strange occurrences. Dad tried to reassure them, but his voice wavered, betraying his own unease. "It's just misplaced things," he muttered, though his gaze kept drifting toward the lake, his brow furrowing. "I'm sure we'll find them." But Jack could see the worry in his eyes, the way he avoided looking at the windows as the sun began to set. That night, the whispers returned, louder, more insistent, echoing through the cabin with a haunting persistence that sent chills down his spine. And this time, he wasn't the only one who heard them. Lucy woke up screaming, clutching her blanket to her chest as she stared wide-eyed at the window. "There were people," she whispered, her voice trembling. "People standing by the lake. They were calling to me." Mom and Dad tried to comfort her, whispering reassurances, but as they exchanged worried glances, Jack saw it, an unspoken fear lurking behind their eyes, a fear they didn't want to admit. And somewhere outside, drifting up from the lake, the whispers continued, filling the night with their strange, beckoning song. The next morning dawned thick and gray, clouds hanging low over the trees, casting the lake into an eerie, colorless shadow. The family moved through the cabin with worry eyes, their footsteps soft, as if afraid to disturb whatever lay hidden in the silence. Breakfast was a somber affair. Lucy clung to her mother's side, refusing to go near the windows, while Jack kept glancing nervously at the lake, his heart racing with each glimpse of the still, black water. When Emily suggested they explore the lake in the small rowboat tied to the dock, Dad hesitated, his gaze lingering on the water with an unreadable expression. But he forced a smile, determined to keep up their spirits. "Sure," he said, though his voice was unsteady. "We'll go for a ride. Just don't lean over the edge. All right?" They made their way to the dock, the wood creaking beneath their feet, the sound unnaturally loud in the stillness. The lake seemed even darker up close, its surface glassy and silent, reflecting the gray sky above. As they stepped into the boat, Jack felt a strange chill settle over him, as though something cold and heavy had wrapped itself around his shoulders. Dad began to row, the oars dipping into the water with a soft, rhythmic splash. The sound was soothing at first, lulling them into a false sense of calm, but Jack couldn't shake the feeling that they were being watched. He glanced over the edge, peering into the depths, but the water was so dark that it was impossible to see more than a few inches down. As they drifted farther from the shore, the air grew colder, the sky seeming to darken, as if the clouds themselves were pressing down on them. The trees lining the shore looked twisted and foreboding, their branches reaching out like skeletal fingers. Jack shivered, wrapping his arms around himself, but when he looked up, he saw that the others were shivering too, their breaths coming in white puffs. Suddenly, a soft ripple broke the surface of the lake just a few feet from the boat. Everyone froze, staring at the spot where the water had stirred. It was a subtle movement, barely more than a gentle undulation, but it sent a chill down Jack's spine. What was that?" Sophie whispered, clutching the side of the boat. Dad shook his head, his eyes wide. "Probably just a fish," he said, though his voice was tight, his knuckles white as he gripped the oars. But Jack wasn't convinced. He kept his gaze fixed on the spot where the ripple had appeared, his heart pounding. For a moment, he thought he saw something, a shape, long and slender, gliding beneath the surface. It was gone in an instant, leaving only the faintest impression, but the image burned itself into his mind. Then, from somewhere beneath the water, he thought he heard a sound, a soft, murmuring whisper, so faint he almost thought he'd imagined it. "Jack," he gasped, his hand flying to his mouth as he glanced at the others. But no one else seemed to have heard. He gripped the side of the boat, his knuckles white, his heart racing as the whisper grew louder, clearer until he could make out the words. "Jack, come closer." The voice was hollow, echoing, as if it were coming from deep within the lake. He looked down, his pulse thundering in his ears, and for a moment, he thought he saw a face staring back at him, a pale, ghostly face with wide, unblinking eyes, floating just beneath the surface. He blinked and it was gone, leaving only his own reflection distorted and wavering. "Jack, are you all right?" Mom asked, her voice breaking through his trance. He forced a smile, nodding quickly. Yeah, I'm fine." But he wasn't fine. He felt as though something was pulling at him, tugging him toward the water, whispering his name in that haunting, hollow voice. They rowed back to shore in silence, each of them lost in their own thoughts, their eyes flickering nervously over the lake. When they reached the dock, they climbed out of the boat, their movements slow and unsteady, as if they were in a trance. As they made their way back to the cabin, Lucy suddenly stopped, her face pale. "Where's my bracelet?" she whispered, her voice trembling. "I had it on when we got in the boat, I know I did." They searched the dock, the boat, even the shoreline, but the bracelet was nowhere to be found. It was as if the lake had swallowed it, taken it as payment. By the time they returned to the cabin, a heavy silence had settled over them, a weight that pressed down on their shoulders and filled their minds with a strange, creeping dread. They tried to go about their day, forcing smiles and laughter, but there was an unease in the air, a feeling that something was watching, waiting. That night, as they sat by the fireplace, the whispers returned, louder and more insistent, filling the cabin with an eerie, disembodied chorus. This time, everyone heard them. They exchanged frightened glances, their faces pale in the flickering firelight. "Do you hear that?" Emily whispered, clutching her blanket to her chest. "It sounds like voices." "It's just the wind," Dad said quickly, though his eyes were wide, his face pale. Nothing to worry about, but they all knew it wasn't just the wind. The whispers grew louder, seeping into the walls, filling every corner of the cabin with their eerie song. Jack's heart pounded as he strained to make out the words, but they slipped through his mind like smoke, just out of reach. And then, all at once, they stopped, leaving the cabin in heavy, suffocating silence. The family sat frozen, listening to the silence, their breaths coming in shallow, panicked gasps. Then, from outside, a soft splash echoed through the night, like something slipping into the water. Jack's blood ran cold, his mind racing as he remembered the face he'd seen in the lake, the voice that had called his name. Without thinking, he stood, moving toward the door. "Jack," Mom whispered, her eyes wide with fear. He hesitated, his hand on the doorknob. "Ozzy just needs some air," he mumbled, though he wasn't sure if that was true. But as he opened the door, a gust of cold wind swept through the cabin, carrying with it the faintest whisper. "Jack, come to us." He stumbled back, slamming the door shut, his heart pounding. The family huddled together, staring at the door, their faces pale and fearful. And outside, the lake lay silent, its dark waters stretching out into the night, waiting. The family barely slept that night, the weight of the whispers hanging heavy over them. When dawn broke, a cold, gray light seeped into the cabin, casting long shadows across the walls. Everyone moved quietly, as though afraid to disturb the silence. It was as if the cabin itself was holding its breath, waiting. Jack was the first to rise, drawn to the window overlooking the lake. In the pale morning light, the water looked even darker, the reflection of the trees stretching out like twisted fingers. He could still feel that pull, an inexplicable urge to go to the lake, to peer beneath its surface. After a silent breakfast, Dad suggested a hike through the woods, hoping a distraction might lift everyone's spirits. They set out as a group, trudging through the dense forest. The crunch of leaves underfoot the only sound in the thick silence. But even as they tried to lose themselves in the woods, the lake remained visible through the gaps in the trees, a dark, looming presence that seemed to follow them wherever they went. Jack couldn't shake the feeling of being watched. Shadows danced in the corners of his vision, and once or twice he thought he saw something move in the trees. A flash of pale skin, a glint of something that might have been eyes. But whenever he turned to look, there's nothing there, only the dense forest stretching out endlessly. Then, as they rounded a bend, Sophie stopped short, her eyes wide. "Look," she whispered, pointing to the ground. There, half buried in the dirt, was something small and white, a bone, thin and brittle, like it had been there for a very, very long time. Dad bent down, brushing the dirt away, revealing more bones scattered in the undergrowth, leading in a faint trail toward the lake. "Animals," Dad said quickly, forcing a smile. "Probably just some old animal remains." But the others only stared, their faces pale. The bones seemed wrong somehow, their shapes twisted, almost human. Jack swallowed hard, his gaze drifting back toward the lake. He could have sworn he saw a figure standing on the shore, watching them from the distance, but when he blinked, it was gone. They returned to the cabin in silence, each of them haunted by the strange trail they'd found. The unease settled over them like a fog, thick and stifling, seeping into every corner of their minds. That night, the whispers returned, louder and more insistent, filling the cabin with their haunting psalm. It was as if the lake itself were calling to them, pulling them closer, urging them to come closer, to look beneath the surface. Around midnight, Jack awoke to find the cabin shrouded in darkness, the only sound the faint whisper of voices drifting through the walls. He sat up, his heart pounding, and saw Emily standing by the window, staring out at the lake with a blank, distant expression. "Emily," he whispered, slipping out of bed. She didn't respond, her gaze fixed on the water. He approached her slowly, placing a hand on her shoulder, and felt a chill seep into his skin, as though her body were as cold as the lake itself. "Emily, what are you doing?" he asked, his voice trembling. She turned to him slowly, her eyes empty, as though she were looking straight through. "They're waiting," she murmured, her voice barely a whisper. "In the water, they're waiting for us." Jack stumbled back, his heart racing. He looked over his shoulder, hoping to see his parents or Sophie awake, but the rest of the cabin was silent, everyone else lost in sleep. When he turned back to Emily, she was gone, the door to the cabin swinging slightly on its hinges. Panic surged through him as he ran to the door, heart pounding as he stepped out into the cold night air. The lake lay before him, dark and silent, stretching out like an endless void. And there, standing at the water's edge, was Emily. "Comely, come back," he called, his voice breaking. But she didn't seem to hear him. She took a step forward, her bare feet sinking into the muddy shore, her gaze fixed on the water. Jack ran toward her, the ground cold and wet beneath his feet, his breath coming in short, frantic gasps. As he reached her, he grabbed her arm, pulling her back. She turned to him, her eyes wide and fearful, as if waking from a trance. "Jack," she whispered, her voice trembling. "They're there in the water. I saw them." They stumbled back together, his arm wrapped protectively around her as they watched the lake. And then, beneath the surface, he saw it, face pale and ghostly, staring up at them with wide, unblinking eyes. It was the face of a child, its mouth open in a silent scream, its eyes hollow and empty. And beside it another face appeared, and another, until a dozen pale, ghostly faces floated just beneath the surface, while staring up at them with the same haunting expression. Jack felt his blood run cold, his heart pounding as he backed away, pulling Emily with him. They stumbled back into the cabin, slamming the door shut, their breaths coming in panic gasps. The family gathered in the living room, eyes wide with fear, as Jack and Emily described what they'd seen. No one spoke, the weight of their words settling over them like a dark cloud. Dad swallowed hard, his gaze drifting to the window. "We're leaving," he said finally, his voice shaking. "We're leaving first thing in the morning." They spent the rest of the night huddled together, jumping at every creak, every whisper of wind. But the lake was relentless, its voices growing louder, filling the cabin with a hollow, echoing song. It was a call, a beckoning, a pull that seeped into their minds and twisted their thoughts. And as the first light of dawn crept over the horizon, they stumbled out of the cabin, their bags packed, their eyes haunted and hollow. They piled into the car, desperate to leave the lake behind, to escape its relentless whispers. But as they drove away, Jack looked back one last time, his heart pounding as he saw a figure standing by the shore. It was tall and thin, its face pale and expressionless, its eyes fixed on the retreating car. And as they rounded the corner, the figure lifted a hand, waving slowly, as if bidding them goodbye or calling them back. As they sped down the winding forest road, the family sat in silence, each of them haunted by the image of that pale, ghostly face, by the voices that still echoed in their minds, whispering from beneath the surface. The drive home was a blur, each family member lost in their own thoughts, haunted by the memories of the lake and the whispers that had called to them. They spoke little in the days that followed, each trying to bury the experience as best they could, but the shadows seemed to linger, creeping into their dreams, filling their nights with unsettling visions of pale faces and dark, endless water. Months passed, and gradually, life resumed its familiar rhythm. The children returned to school, the parents to work, and the lake became a memory they barely spoke of. But sometimes, late at night, when the world was quiet, Jack would hear faint whispers drifting through the house. He would lie awake, straining to listen, his heart pounding as the familiar voice reached out to him from the dark. Then, one winter evening, a package arrived. It was wrapped in faded brown paper, tied with a thin, brittle string. No return address, no markings, just their last name scrawled on the front in a strange, spidery handwriting. Dad frowned as he turned it over, inspecting the worn paper. "Did anyone order something?" he asked, but everyone shook their heads, equally puzzled. They gathered around the table as he carefully unwrapped the package, peeling back the paper to reveal an old, worn journal, its leather cover cracked and faded. The pages were yellowed with age, the edges brittle. Jack's heart skipped a beat as he stared at the journal, a chill creeping over him. Mom opened it to the first page, her hands trembling slightly. Written in the same spidery handwriting was a name, Theodore Craning. Dad's uncle, the man who had left them the cabin by the lake. They turned the pages in silence, reading entries that grew stranger, more desperate as they went on. The writing was erratic, scrawled in shaky letters, detailing Theodore's growing obsession with the lake. He wrote of whispers, of shadows, of faces that watched him from beneath the surface, whispering promises, begging me to join them. I cannot resist much longer. The lake, it knows my name, it knows my secrets. Soon, I will be one of them, lost beneath the water, bound to the voices forever. The family sat in stunned silence, the weight of the words pressing down on them, thick and suffocating. And then, Jack noticed something. A small, folded piece of paper tucked into the back of the journal. He pulled it out, his hands shaking as he unfolded it. It was a photograph, faded and blurry, but he recognized the setting immediately. It was the lake, dark and still, stretching out into the forest. But there, standing on the shore, were 6 shadowy figures. Jack's breath caught in his throat as he recognized them. Mom, Dad, Emily, Sophie, Lucy, and himself. Their faces were blank, their eyes hollow, staring out at him with an unnatural emptiness. He dropped the photograph, his hands trembling as he backed away from the table. The others stared at him, their eyes wide with horror as they realized what they were seeing. And then, from somewhere deep within the house, a faint whisper echoed through the silence, cold and hollow, calling their names one by one. Jack, Emily, Lucia. The whispers grew louder, filling the room surrounding them, a haunting echo of the lake's song. They tried to move, to run, but it was as if the air itself had thickened, holding them in place. The photograph lay on the table, the faces in the image seeming to shift, to blur, as if the figures were slipping away, dissolving into shadows. And then, all at once, the voices stopped, leaving only the hollow, suffocating silence. In the days that followed, the family was never seen again. The house lay empty, silent, save for the faintest whisper that drifted through the halls on quiet nights. A whisper that seemed to echo from somewhere far away, from the depths of a dark, endless lake. And somewhere, deep beneath the water's surface, 6 pale, ghostly faces stared up from the depths, waiting patiently, bound forever to the whispers of the lake.